Welcome, this is the first of the 2020 open days at the Niab CUF site for CUPGRA members. It's going to be a virtual event, as when you're viewing this you will see it online. Bit of a disappointment, but we're trying to do our best to bring this through. I'm Stalham, I'm head of the group here, and as traditional what we're going to do is go through a seasonal overview explaining what we've led up to in terms of experiments, and then each of us is going to take an individual area or a combination of areas and talk about that in more detail. So you'll see interspersed with this there are videos and individual still shots of plots or demonstrations, and they're there to really sort of guide you in terms of what we're talking about. So we're in the fourth year of experiments on this side of the A14 over at Niab. Luckily we're on a much lighter soil here. The majority of the field that we're in here is a sandy loam, about 12 to 14% clay content, so we're sort of blessed with some really good soil here. But we have got a spot which we'll visit a little bit later and Mark Allison will talk about, and that is very much dealing with a heavy area that really is only about 18% clay content and is a different cultivation strategy potentially for many growers. So where do we all start? Well, it's a season of contrast. We'll realise we're standing here in the beginning of the second week of June, but we've had a very wet winter, much less wet than many people around the country, but nevertheless soils were at field capacity right until the end of February, to a certain extent over field capacity, and that affected the way we treated the cover crop, as Mark Allison will explain a little bit later. But by the beginning of March things were beginning to change. Temperatures in March, instead of being below average, were slightly higher than average or average, and as we moved through March became progressively drier, and we moved into the spell where we were considering cultivations. Now, those of you who've been following this strategy for the last 3 years will realise that we have made some quite monumental muck-ups in terms of cultivation, largely caused by the weather. This year we were determined to get it right, and so the field that we actually started with was a cover crop over its entire area, and we mowed it at the end of March. What we've got then is the decision, should we plough? So consequently we decided to actually fixed time cultivate, which many growers have been moving to rather than inversion techniques. But by and large what we did was progressive cultivation very much at the end of March on 2 sequential days, and the soil was beginning to dry out enough, certainly in the lighter areas of the field, to go down to the depth we needed for our rototilling. So rototilling took place very quickly after that, 3-4 days later, and we ended up with ridges which allows us to plant our experiments by hand into those preformed ridges. Good deep soil ridges, as good as we've probably had, albeit some of the soils were really quite dry because it was turning dry at the beginning of April when we started cultivating. So in terms of where we fit in terms of commercial regime, we were ready to plant on the 6th, 7th of April, and we did intend and actually started then. So our earliest experiments went in at that stage, and due to COVID-19 and restrictions, and also the lack of seed coming down from Scotland and elsewhere, meant that we really didn't finish our first plantings until the end of April. So we had a 2.5 week planting period. The weather was fantastic, and those who remember that the radiation environments that we've got, which are detailed in a table showing the Met data, that April was very bright, just under 30% brighter than average, but many crops were basically not emerged at that stage. So we were looking at soil warming. In converse, whilst we had average temperatures higher than average, we were actually getting very cold nights, so therefore the balance wasn't as great in terms of potential emergence. May turned on and suddenly the sunlight came out, and those of you who've seen the recent records from the Met Office, it's the brightest calendar month ever recorded, including June, July and August, that we've ever had in the UK. Typically we would get around 500 and something megajoules at this time, and we were getting 691 megajoules. That's 34% increase on average. As a consequence, anything that emerged would grow rapidly in response to that. The key was it was very dry, and whilst our soils returned pretty close to field capacity at the end of April following 3 days of rain, we were still dry in the surface, and therefore we've irrigated. To date we've put on 43 millimetres, and by the time you see this video it will be nearer 64 millimetres. So we've addressed the water needs, and we've actually got to the stage we were in terms of potential. As a background to this field, basically our nitrogen goes on post-emergence, so as soon as the first crops were emerging, we were putting on nitrogen for the whole field, 200 kilograms as a base rate over the entire field, with the exception of where we're doing nitrogen treatments. We've followed the standard protocol for herbicide post-emergence, and also having to deal with the oats as a cover crop coming through. We've applied a graminicide to that state. We've done 2 blight programs to date, and where we are now is in a great potential for setting up. So the experiment you can see behind us, Mark Allison will talk about, but here we are on the 9th of June with crop canopies at best approaching 60%, and so the potential for us to get to full ground cover by the longest day is well there for the rest of the experimental area.